let's talk about unused merchandise drawback first. And within that, there's two different types. The first is direct identification unused merchandise drawback. And that's just, that is just what it sounds like. It's like the example I mentioned earlier. If I import 100 widgets and I export the same 100 widgets, I can file a claim for a refund of the duties and fees paid upon importation. You need to be able to track those goods. That's why they call it direct identification. That can be done via lot number, serial number, or if it's a fungible merchandise, what they call a drawback accounting method. First in a warehouse, first out a warehouse, for example. But you need to be able to do that. You need to be able to track that and have the paperwork showing that the goods that came in are the same goods that went out, or if they're fungible, that you accounted for properly. You don't necessarily have to submit that when you make your drawback claim, but you should have that documentation available should customs ask. Incidental operations to the goods, these goods that you've imported are allowed, by the way. So if you import these goods, you can test them, you can manipulate the packaging. Certain incidental operations like that are allowed, and you can still claim drawback. So that is direct identification unused merchandise drawback. The second type of unused merchandise drawback is what they call substitution drawback. This is a little more complicated than direct identification merchandise drawback because it allows you to say if you import 100 widgets, you can export a different 100 widgets and claim drawback on those. So again, it's like it sounds. If you bring in one type of product, you can export the same type of product, although it doesn't have to be the same merchandise that you imported. So the issue in this case becomes, what merchandise can I substitute for my imported merchandise? Under the old standard, there was a concept known as commercially interchangeable. So if I imported goods, I could substitute goods that were commercially interchangeable with those goods, export them, and claim drawback. Commercial interchangeability was a bit of an unwieldy standard. There were 4 factors the government would consider when deciding whether or not 2 different products were commercially interchangeable. They'd review government industry standards, part numbers, tariff classifications, and the relative value of the goods. So there was an element of subjectivity to it. Under the new drawback law, that again just went into effect last year, substitution drawback is dictated by an 8-digit tariff classification. So if you import goods that are classified under one 8-digit number, you can substitute those goods with anything classified within that 8-digit number, which is much easier. Classification, although there is some gray area in some classifications, it's much more objective than the commercial interchangeability standard. This being customs law, however, there is a caveat to this new 8-digit substitution standard, and it has to do with tariff provisions that are what we call other provisions. I'm assuming a lot of you guys in this webinar are familiar with the HTS classification system, but there are many codes in the harmonized tariff schedule that just cover other goods. So if the larger heading covers widgets, there's all different types of widgets that fall underneath it, and then there's a catch-all provision, which is another provision. So if the 8-digit HTS number is an other provision, you have to go down to the 10-digit. And the 10-digit numbers, the 10-digit number of the imported good must match the 10-digit number of the outgoing good. However, another caveat, if the 10-digit HTS is also an other provision, there's no substitution drawback allowed. So that is the caveat. Although generally speaking, the 8-digit standard is easier to implement than the commercial interchangeability standard, there is that caveat with certain provisions, which is something you should be aware of. That's substitution unused merchandise drawback.